1953. Two daredevils set foot on the top of the world for the first time. Everest is conquered. The best of the best rush after them, driven by a thirst for glory and challenge. But 1 in 4 pay a terrible price for this risk. The mountains are impartial, they accept only those stronger than death itself. But where there is danger, there are those who turn it into a business. In 1992, Rob Hall, an experienced mountaineer, created a company offering wealthy thrill seekers a ticket to the roof of the world. Extreme tourism has become an entire industry. Within 4 years, his team leads clients to the top, making 19 successful ascents without a single casualty. Inspired by his example, others begin to open their own tours to make a fortune. In May 1996, 20 expeditions gather at the foot of the mountain. The mountain becomes as crowded as a crowded marketplace. And then everything goes wrong. The story begins 6 weeks before the climb. Rob Hall and his colleagues are reloading gear from a pickup truck into a cargo cart. A journalist joins their group. While waiting for the flight out, Rob talks to his pregnant wife. The remaining participants arrive in Kathmandu, the energetic Texan Beck, the letter carrier Duck, and the journalist John. At the airport, they quickly find common themes. It turns out that Duck has already been to the south summit of Everest and has climbed several other legendary peaks, one of which Beck has never been able to conquer. Respect is born instantly, in the mountains, where resilience solves everything. Such achievements mean more than any words. But soon there is more than just climbing waiting for them. Everest has its own challenges, and not everyone will be able to make it back down. The guests arrive at the hotel, the last oasis of comfort before the harsh reality of the mountains. In the spacious lobby, Rob Hall reminds them that the path they're on was reserved only for legendary climbers. But it's not just a route, it's a challenge where the slightest mistake can turn tragic. Neglect of safety techniques, wrong decision, sudden change of weather, and fingers, hands, legs can become the price for one mistake. The human body is not adapted for such heights, where the air is thin, so you need to be careful. The group has 40 days to prepare. The first stage is a flight to Lukla, a small town wedged between steep slopes at an altitude of 2,860 meters. From here, the trek begins. With each passing day, the route becomes more and more difficult. The thin air makes it harder to breathe, and strength drains away faster than it can be regained. Beck, whose body is resisting the new climate, suffers especially badly. The base camp, located at an altitude of 5,364 meters, resembles a small tent city set up right on the glacier. There is nervous excitement amongst the large team, a week of adaptive climbing ahead to prepare the body for the altitude. Scott Fisher, another professional climber, is already at work on the slope, setting up ladders and safety ropes on the ice falls. The dangerous section, where ice masses can collapse at any moment, requires extreme attention. The first ascent starts with ice falls, chaotically piled blocks of ice that crack and move every second. Getting through this section is like walking through a minefield. During the ascent, Doc begins to cough painfully, which does not subside even at rest. On the next ascent, another problem is discovered. There are only 2 routes, but there are too many climbers. Traffic jams form in narrow places. People are forced to stand for several hours. In such places, standing for a long time is tantamount to death. As you might expect, Beck's fingers begin to feel numb, and then lose sensation altogether. He slips off the ladder while crossing a crevasse, but is pulled out in time. The accumulated irritation grows into open resentment. In such circumstances, a long wait becomes a real life-threatening situation. Rob Hall offers the other tour organizers to come to a compromise, but they fail to find a common solution. However, the other organizers are in no hurry to make concessions. Hall then joins forces with Scott Fisher, hoping that climbing together will help control the situation. A couple days before the final climb comes news from home. Hall's wife announces that she has learned the sex of their unborn child. This news momentarily transports him to a world without ice, cold, and deadly risk. The next day they begin their ascent of Jomolungma Peak. The altitude takes its toll. One of the participants falls ill, and Fisher is forced to descend with him to an intermediate camp. At the same time an ice avalanche descends from the peak, which almost sweeps away the climber. Hall manages to catch him before he falls into the abyss. There is no time for a breather. At the third camp, Hall contacts Fisher. He has already lowered the injured man and started climbing again, but his body is failing. He has to administer medication to maintain his strength. Meanwhile, from Helen's base camp comes important news. A storm is coming from the Indian Ocean. According to forecasters' calculations, it will cover Everest on May 11th. They reach the fourth temporary camp at an altitude of 7,951 meters. A night at this altitude becomes an ordeal. Intense, blown by the icy wind, they sleep in oxygen masks. This is where Scott Fisher catches up with them. Anatoly Bukreyev, his team guide, warns that it is too risky to climb in the morning. The wind is picking up and a storm is approaching. But Fisher decides to wait until morning, hoping the weather will change. May 10th welcomes them with no wind. The plan is clear. By 2 p.m. the group must reach the summit and immediately begin their descent, otherwise they risk being trapped by darkness and the approaching storm. As they climb up the slope, Beck begins to experience problems with his eyes. The world in front of him becomes blurry, outlines disappearing in a white haze. Hall leaves him in a secluded place and plans to send a guide to him. But at this time the group encounters an unexpected problem. The ropes, which should have been stretched in advance on the dangerous section, have disappeared. The hikers and guides are forced to lose valuable time fixing the ropes themselves. Doug follows the main group but suddenly has a coughing fit. He falls behind and the others are forced to wait, losing their last strength in the icy wind. Some of the climbers decide to turn back. As they pass Beck, they offer him to come down with them, but he refuses. Meanwhile, the rope fixing is finally completed. Anatoly Bukreyev, one of the guides, and the journalist John are the first to overcome the dangerous section. The summit is conquered. Flags are proudly flying at the height of 8,848 meters. Doug is still on his way. When he finally reaches the surface, his steps become increasingly heavy. He seems to be pushing himself to the limit. But sleep won't let him stop. He can't turn back, too much is at stake. 2 attempts to reach the summit have already failed. There won't be a third chance. Hall makes a decision, to help him get to the top. Together they continue the climb, but time is working against them. The time is 4 p.m. and they have just reached the summit. That's 2 hours behind their planned descent. The storm is coming. The situation is rapidly deteriorating. The storm is approaching and Doug's oxygen tank is running low. Wading through the increasing wind, the hikers take a blinded Beck with them. Hall contacts the radio to ask for an oxygen tank for Doug. Fisher falls to the snow, completely exhausted. He urgently needs oxygen, but he can't walk. He sends an assistant to fetch Anatoly Bukreyev, an experienced climber who can climb without oxygen equipment. At the same time, Hall tries to lower Doug down the rope, but the storm is gaining strength dramatically. Snow swirls reduce visibility to almost zero. On the narrow passage at the Hillary Step, Doug, exhausted and already out of touch with reality, unhooks his carabiner. The next second he disappears into the bottomless abyss. After a while, a guide with an oxygen tank finds Hall, but he sits in a complete daze, unresponsive to what is happening. Down below, frozen and powerless, Scott Fisher is no longer giving signs of life. The part of the group that is able to move reaches the 4th camp at midnight and decides to return with help. Anatoly Bukreyev goes in search of them. He finds the remaining people, gives them oxygen and takes them one by one to the camp. However, he does not notice that Beck, who was already considered dead, is still alive and fighting for life. Hall and his guide try to open the last oxygen tank, but the valve freezes. The storm is getting worse. Hall does not notice his companion, falling into hypothermia, begins to tear off his clothes and eventually falls into the abyss. At base camp, Hall's voice manages to be heard through the doctor's interference. He is buried under the snow, unable to feel his arms and legs and unable to move. The camp contacts his wife. At this time, the rescuers climb the mountain, but the storm erupts with renewed force, forcing them to turn back. His wife begins to cry when she learns that her husband has been left alone on the summit of Mount Everest without help. He says goodbye to his wife, discussing their future child. He then lies down in the snow and falls asleep for good. Already listed as injured, Beck regains consciousness and crawls to the camp. He is evacuated by helicopter, but loses his arms and nose. The other survivors return home. The remaining climbers who survive the nightmarish descent make it to base camp and then return home. The movie ends with a series of photographs of real-life prototypes of the dead climbers, whose bodies still rest in the snows of Everest. That's all for today. Share your impressions in the comments and subscribe to the channel. All the best.